You're listening to the Fit Bottom Girls podcast, the only podcast for active, athletic, and adventurous women and those who aspire to be. We've got your back as you navigate the ups and the downs of motherhood, midlife, and menopause. I'm your host, Allison Hylett, here to remind you that female isn't fragile. I'm a strength, conditioning, and nutrition coach who's trained hundreds of women to achieve their goals to get fit, lift heavy, go the distance, and feel like a badass in every area of their lives. Each week, you'll hear from me and some of our awesome guests as we educate and empower you during each stage of your fitness journey, whether you're already crushing it, fighting to get back out there, or starting from day one. So friends, let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fit Bottomed Girls podcast. I cannot tell you how pumped I am to share this episode with you today. The online space has become packed with information about cortisol from hormone coaches and hormone balancing experts on social media. And a lot of times, their claims directly contradict what I've seen in the scientific research. And on top of that, they are so scary. So I invited Dr. Carla DiGirolamo here today to help me sort through what's true and what's complete bullshit when it comes to claims made about cortisol on social media. Dr. Carla is a double board certified obstetrician, gynecologist, and reproductive endocrinologist specializing in caring for active and high-performing women from puberty through menopause. Dr. Carla completed her residency training in obstetrics and gynecology at Brown University Medical School, Women's and Infants Hospital, and her reproductive endocrinology fellowship training was at Massachusetts General Hospital at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Carla has 20 years of experience as a fertility specialist and more recently as a Menopause Society Certified Practitioner. She has been in the fitness industry her entire life as a recreational athlete and for more than a decade as a fitness professional with credentials as a CrossFit Level 1 trainer and a certified nutrition coach. As a pioneer in women's performance endocrinology, she specializes in optimizing mental and physical performance in women in high-performance professions and female athletes of all ages. So yeah, we're bringing out the big guns today. Let's get into it. Welcome, Dr. Carla. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Allison. It's a pleasure.
If your experience on social media is anything like mine, you can't scroll and catch up with your friends and family's lives on Instagram without scrolling past about 72 posts on how high cortisol will make you fat and ugly and it will kill you. And many of these posts blame hard workouts and intense fitness training, and they're warning women to stay away from high intensity exercise in favor of low intensity and low impact work. But here's where it really gets confusing for me and why I asked you on is that I'm noticing that the research now is strongly supporting women doing high intensity exercise, heavy lifting, plyometric or impact training for good health throughout their entire lifespan for a bunch of reasons related to health and longevity. So I asked you here because I want to know who's right. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's start with cortisol. We call it a stress hormone. Today, I even saw one hormone coach call it the death hormone on Instagram. So let's talk about it. What is cortisol and what does it do for us?
This is a great question, and I do a lot of talks on this, and I'm asked to do a lot of podcast appearances on this too, because everybody, to your point, is confused about that. And I think part of the reason why is because there needs to be an understanding that cortisol is just one of many, many players in a whole system it's called many things. It's called the fight or flight response. It's called the stress response system. It's called the sympathetic nervous system. And what this hormonal system is, it's like an orchestra. Cortisol is like just the trombone, but there's like a whole orchestra there that has to work in sync for the system to work properly. And the whole purpose of the fight or flight or the stress response or the cortisol system is to allow the body to respond to a threat or a challenge. That's the whole reason it's there, is for survival. It's very much ingrained in evolution, and it helps us to survive the various challenges and threats we encounter in the environment. So that's the reason for it. Now, when we're doing a workout, it's a physical challenge. And so when the clock goes off or when the starting gun goes, or even just your workout timer, you're going to get that little surge of all of those hormones. The system is then going to be activated, and then you're going to start doing your training. And what is required for you to engage in that training and respond to the challenge is that the system has to be activated. And then once the workout is over, then the stress response system says, okay, the physical challenge is done. We're going to dial it down now and return to baseline. And so whether it's a workout, whether it's an illness, whether it's a bear in the woods ready to eat you, if that system isn't activated, then you're not going to survive the threat. So cortisol is essential for life. This system is essential for life. You cannot live without cortisol. You cannot live without this system. So it's actually the hormone of life, not the hormone of death.
I love
You
that.
cannot live without it. Yeah. The key is returning that stress response system to baseline. And if you can return it to baseline, then that response has been very effective, because once it's at baseline, it's ready for the next challenge. Where we run into problems is when the threat is ongoing, or the challenge or the insult to the body is ongoing, and that system can never reach equilibrium again. It's like having your car parked in the driveway, it's home, but the engine's on idling. It's just idling. And so there's wear and tear on the car. Even though it's not moving, even though it's parked in the driveway, it's idling. It's using up gas, it's wear and tear, and eventually that engine's going to shut off. So what we need to do is to not only get the car parked, but we need to turn it off and let it cool down so that it's ready to start the next day. And this is where the challenge is because especially in midlife, if we're dealing with or perimenopause, it becomes increasingly difficult sometimes for various circumstances to get that return to equilibrium. So the cortisol is not the problem. You need the cortisol to live. You need the cortisol to get fitter, because in midlife, we're also experiencing decline in muscle mass, power, and strength. We're experiencing decline in bone density. And in order to keep those things active and healthy, you have to push the limits of your fitness. You have to, or else you're not going to get fitter. But the key is to recover properly. And so we need to be more strategic with our training and our recovery so that we can use our stress response system effectively to get fitter, but to keep us out of that danger zone of the car idling in the driveway.
I love that, because looking at it through the lens of, there's a reason why all of this stuff goes on in our body. Our body is revving up and preparing to face a challenge, and it needs to be properly fueled and properly resourced in order to have those responses. And that's not a bad thing, but you obviously don't want to live in a constant state of being ready for a challenge at all the times.
Well, part of being ready for a challenge is having that stress response system return to equilibrium. So you are technically, mentally, and physiologically ready for that next challenge. When you are not ready is when you haven't returned to baseline. So what we're trying to avoid is that chronic activation of the stress response system. And so people aren't too far off when they talk about achieving balance, because the balance you have to achieve is getting the system back to equilibrium. So if you've had some really tough workouts, you want to make sure that, okay, we're going to spend time doing mobility. We're going to do some yoga, because yoga and breath work and meditation are great for dialing down the stress response system and helping it to return to normal. So, one of the things that maybe in our 20s and 30s we could get away with skipping is the cool down. Okay, you do your workout and, okay, I'm going to stretch my quads for about 30 seconds and then I'm on my way. We don't get away with that anymore. So, I mean, especially in midlife, when we're dealing with the changing hormones of menopause and, a bit more of a struggle with resilience, you have to pay a little more attention to that cool down. Because if you do, that stress response system will return to normal, and then you will be ready for that intense workout that is going to happen in another day or two. And, it's not just all about exercise. There are a lot of things that can cause chronic activation of the stress response, or preventing that stress response from returning to normal. It could be life stressors. God forbid you could be in a terrible relationship. Maybe you're going through a divorce. Maybe you're dealing with aging parents. These are things that are long-term chronic things. And when you are constantly in that state of stress, your response system is going to be activated, and it's going to be more difficult to get back to equilibrium. So in cases like that, where it's life, job, family stressors, you may want to get a coach, a therapist, somebody who can help you find that way to unplug just for a little bit, to help bring that stress response system back to normal. Sleep is another one. I mean, that is critical. And a lot of times when we're dealing with medical problems, with stress and anxiety, depression during the day, it interferes with sleep. And if it interferes with sleep, that is another stressor on the body that's preventing it from recovering. So, it doesn't just center around physical activity. It centers around anything in our environment that is causing a chronic stressor, either mentally or physically.
So is there any correlation between persistently elevated cortisol and burnout? Do we see any overlap there?
So it's interesting. It depends on the population that you study. So in the general population, which is usually a sedentary population, it's very well known, it's very well published and documented that persistently elevated cortisol levels in the general population are correlated with health issues. However, in the athletic population, especially endurance athletes who do triathlons and marathons and whose training sessions are typically very long, these are athletes that maybe train 10, 12 or more hours a week. Their cortisols are going to be high, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing because they're training all the time. So when you think about the triathlete versus the person in the general population, when the person in the general population has a chronically elevated cortisol, it's probably due to something bad going on. When you've got a triathlete, they're training. That is their sport. This is a physiologic thing for them. So I think it is true that in the general population, those elevated levels are correlated with badness. I think it's very different in athletes in the competitive and elite range, especially if they're endurance athletes. I don't think those chronically elevated cortisols mean the same thing because this is generally a different reason for cortisol being elevated. I have so many athletes that come to me very frustrated that, oh my God, they check my cortisol, it's high. What do I do? I want to train for my marathon. And of course, they're getting all stressed out about it and driving their cortisol higher. But I tell them, if all the metrics look good, if they're fueling properly, if they're performing well, if they're not injured, if they feel well, I am not as concerned about it because it's a very different population. So it really depends on who you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's one component in a whole system. And the only reason why we talk about it is because that is the one that we happen to be able to measure. It's not all about cortisol. You've got epinephrine, norepinephrine, you've got all of these other neurotransmitters firing away in the brain. You got the immune system that's getting fired up. There's a whole other cascade of other things that.
And I imagine then it's hard to separate what each individual piece does on its own. Yeah.
It is. It's like listening to the orchestra and trying to pick out by ear, every single instrument and every single piece that instrument is doing. You just want to sit back and listen to the orchestra. That's really the best way to look at it. So if we're thinking about the stress response orchestra, and if we're talking about burnout, it's more that the burnout's causing the chronic elevation of the stress response, not the stress response causing the burnout. This is all about the underlying cause more than the levels themselves, because the levels are just reflective of the underlying cause. So really, people get all bent out of shape about those levels when they're really should be paying attention to what's driving those levels. You got to figure that out if you are going to bring that system back into equilibrium. So when I talk to patients, I'm asking them about everything. I want to know about their aging parents. I want to know about their relationships. I want to know, do they have chronic diseases? What is their training schedule? What's their fueling like? And energy availability, particularly in women, is a huge, huge driver of the stress response because women by nature are very sensitive to fuel availability because if we choose to do so, we carry pregnancies. And Mother Nature has made sure that if we're going to carry a pregnancy, there needs to be enough fuel around. So we tend to be very sensitive to energy availability. When it's not around, the body perceives it as a threat, like there's a famine happening, and the stress response system is activated.
Interesting. Just to back up, I really love the way that you said that. It's not the cortisol. The cortisol is just responding to, it's doing its job. It's responding to something in the environment. And you're getting mad at the cortisol for raising the red flag rather than necessarily looking at the things that are making that red flag go up.
That's right. That's exactly right. The cortisol is not the enemy here. It's like the messenger. Yeah, it's essential for life. The fact that cortisol, that if you detect it and it happens to be high, it means it's doing its job. But what is the threat that it's addressing? That's where you got to get to it. And I think that's where people lose their way, where they focus on the blood test rather than the underlying cause. And I think the other thing that's very important about talking about, and I'm going to put cortisol in quotes because all it is one player in a big system, is that, first of all, you have to detect it accurately. The thing about cortisol and why it is very difficult to interpret blood tests is because it is secreted in pulses. It goes on a circadian rhythm. And if you just happen to draw blood on the height of the pulse, you might think someone has elevated cortisol levels when really you just caught it on the height of the pulse. It's not secreted in a steady state. So the gold standard of cortisol detection is a 24-hour urine collection. That collects cortisol all throughout the day at the different levels it's being secreted at. And that is the gold standard. Now, collecting 24 hours worth of urine is not very practical. And most of us aren't really prepared to do that every day. The Dutch test does a pretty good job. They have you take different urine samples at different times of the day. That certainly comes a lot closer than just a random blood test. But people have to make sure that they're getting an accurate picture of what these levels are doing. But the reason why I hate talking about cortisol individually outside of the whole stress response system is that people then start chasing the level rather than chasing the underlying cause. It then all becomes about the cortisol levels when it's really not. It's really about the underlying cause. So if we find out that somebody is underfueling and overtraining, and we see that, yes, these are real cortisol levels that are elevated, her CRP is high and there's other markers of inflammation that are raging, and we find out, oh, okay, she is running that marathon on 1,200 calories a day. Okay, well, we're going to address that. We're going to fuel properly and say we're 3 months down the road. She feels great. She's running the best marathon of her life. She's sleeping. She's healthier. I honestly don't care what her cortisol levels are at that point. It's all about the performance. It's all about what the other health metrics are. Because you could check her cortisol after her best marathon of her life, and it's still going to be high, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You address the underlying cause. And that random elevated cortisol might be just because she's training for a marathon and not be something that you have to chase.
If somebody is training for a long endurance event, they're putting a lot of training time in, and they are existing on an underfueled calorie intake, which I see a lot of women doing.
Yeah.
Because I train marathoners, triathletes, and ultra marathoners. And so I see a lot of this. And when they're dealing with elevated levels of cortisol and you're able to detect that and you get their fueling up to par so that they're able to properly fuel the output that they're expecting of themselves. It's not that their nervous system has gone rogue. The red flag is trying to tell you you're underfueling the system, right? And the supplements that are being sold by some of these hormone coaches online are not targeting the right problem. They're, like you said, they're going after the cortisol, but they're not going after the actual underlying issue that cortisol is trying to raise red flags about. But when you fuel them up and those problems dissipate, then we realize, okay, it wasn't really about the cortisol, the bad cortisol death hormone making you sick. It was because you were not fueling properly for what you were trying to do.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Bingo, you got it. Cortisol is not the only metric of good health out there. It's just one little marker. It's one piece of a puzzle, of a very big puzzle. When patients come to see me and they're experiencing X, Y, or Z, yes, I use cortisol. Sometimes I use random ones, but I use so many other markers too, in addition to what they're telling me. So it's just one piece of the puzzle that tells me, okay, what is the underlying cause? And then we address the underlying cause. I'm not going to go chasing that one piece of the puzzle because that's going to just have you go down a rabbit hole you don't need to go down. But you want to address the underlying cause and then look at the big picture, not just those cortisol levels, but the big picture. What's her blood pressure doing? What's her blood sugar doing? How does she feel? Talk to her. God forbid we talk to anybody these days with all the tech. We can learn so much from people just by talking to them.
Yes.
So there's a lot of other metrics. There's a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that are going to give you the picture of really what reality is, not just chasing some one random number.
Yeah. When I went through a period of low energy availability, I went to see an endocrinologist and I was in her office for an hour and a half where she was just asking me every question under the sun. And I really appreciated that because it was really taking such a broader look at, I mean, she was going to do all the testing too, but that data did not alleviate her responsibility to understand the patient in front of her and what factors might be leading to the lab results that she would see later. The lab results tell us there's an elevation and stuff. It doesn't tell us why. Understanding the patient is a really important component of that. Like you said, taking in the whole picture and not just zeroing in on this one hormone that may or may not even be elevated at all.
And, and the other thing about endocrinology, I've been practicing endocrinology for about 18 years. And the one thing that's true about it is that lab tests only give you a snapshot. So you're taking a picture of the hormone dynamic in an instant of time that you drew the blood from the patient. And it's limited because it's just 1 second in time when the hormonal systems are constantly changing all the time. And secondly, hormones have different effects. This is especially true of the reproductive hormones like estrogen, progesterone. They have different effects in the brain, in the bone, in the muscle. And the little nuances of what's going on specifically in the brain and the bone and the muscle may not be even detectable in the bloodstream. It's like being in the cul-de-sac of a neighborhood, right? You're standing in the street. You're in the street, you're looking at all the houses, but you don't necessarily know what's going on in the houses because they're their own little systems in and of themselves. And so those are the two big limitations of blood testing in endocrinology, is that it gives you only really an instant snapshot of time, doesn't tell you about how, the whole system is going on an hourly, daily basis.
Yeah.
And two, it doesn't tell you what's going on in the tissues necessarily. I draw a lot of hormones when I'm trying to rule out chronic disease. It certainly has its utility. But there's a lot of limitations there because I think we've all gone to the doctor, especially as women, and maybe we have PMS or maybe we have menopause and we feel like we're ready to jump off the roof. And the doctor says, oh, all your labs are normal. Your labs are normal, right? Well, yeah, okay, because those lab tests are not telling you everything that's going on in the tissues. But she will tell you, no, I'm not fine because I've got hot flashes and I'm up every single night and I'm ready to scream the next day. So the key about lab testing is that you have to know what it tells you and what it doesn't tell you. I think your endocrinologist is spot on. You have to sit and talk to people and understand their experiences to understand what the problem is.
Yeah, because these are just chemical messengers. They're responding. If they're healthy, they're responding to something. That's what we want. We want our systems to be responsive, not static and unchangeable. They need to be responding to the environment.
For sure. For sure.
Hey, you. I wanted to press pause on this episode for a second to talk about your fitness goals. Those sweet dreams of being more active and feeling athletic and confident and doing epic, adventurous shit. Or maybe you just feel like you're getting older, because we're all getting older. And you, like me, never want to give up on carrying all the groceries into the house in one shot or picking up that heavy Amazon box without worrying that you're going to throw your back out. I know you're busy. You're probably listening to this episode while multitasking. Oh yeah, I'm on to you. And the biggest thing that's stopping you from getting strong and fit is knowing how to use your workout time most effectively. Like exactly which exercises are worth your time, when to do them, and the number of sets and reps to get to your goals. You probably also tried other fitness apps and programs out there, only to feel like they weren't right for your needs. You want a program that has it all: strength, power, cardio, mobility, and recovery, all built right in without spending your whole life in the gym. And you want experienced coaches around to answer your questions, and a community at your back to help you stay motivated and inspired. Look, I've been coaching women for a long time now, and the truth is that you don't need another fad diet or complicated, time-consuming workout routine to support you as you age. You just need to train smarter with simple, progressive workouts and a plan that's designed for your body and your life, whether you're navigating motherhood, midlife, or menopause. And if this sounds like exactly what you've been missing, I invite you to join Stronger 365, a progressive strength, power, and conditioning training membership for women like you who are ready to stop winging it and take their training to the next level with more structure and support. And the best part? This program has 3 different options, so you can choose your own fitness adventure based on your goals, how much time you have to train, and what equipment you have, whether you've got access to a full gym or, like me, work out at home. And it's run by me, Allison Heilig, and my awesome team at Miles to Go Athletics. Head over to the show notes for all the details and to join our membership community. And as an FBG, your first 2 weeks are on me. And now, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, so we're talking about cortisol in general. Do cortisol levels tend to change throughout a woman's lifespan?
Levels themselves, as we talked about, are constantly changing. So there is no normal levels, so to speak. There's a reference range of normal, and I think it's about the same no matter what the age group is. But what does change is our reproductive hormonal systems are changing. And when ovarian estrogen production is declining, when periods are becoming irregular, or when they finally are absent in the case of menopause, our ability to respond to stress becomes a little bit less resilient. I think Dr. Stacy Sims gives the perfect analogy of this. She calls the menstrual cycles and the hormones of reproductive age as a buffer that is like a cushion between stressors and the stress response system. When we have cycling estrogen and all of that is functioning as regularly as it does during reproductive age, there's a buffer there. We're more resilient. We can bounce back quicker. But when that buffer is gone, in the case of perimenopause and menopause, we're not quite as able to bounce back so quickly. And so as we approach midlife, men go through this too, because their testosterone declines much more gradually than women's, but men experience this too, where it's tougher to recover as we get older. It's a combination of age and it is a combination of hormonal change. And so that is why in midlife, we have to pay more attention to those longer warm-ups and cool downs, making sure you do that mobility work, doing that meditation and breath work to bring the mind down, because the mind and the body are connected. And fueling becomes that much more important too, because again, females are particularly sensitive to energy imbalance. And that is even more so as we get along in life and when our reproductive hormones change. So our resiliency changes as we get older, not necessarily the levels themselves, but this does not mean you die on the vine and stop working out. It just means you have to pay more attention to your recovery after those workouts. You need the workouts because your bone density is declining, your muscle is declining. To get fitter, you have to push the limits, but you got to recover. And that's where the magic is, and that's where the attention should be.
Yeah. So don't avoid the stressor. Chris, recover better.
Exactly. Make sure you're sleeping, which is a challenge during midlife. If you have hot flashes and you're not sleeping, you go see your doctor. There are lots of great therapies out there that are effective for hot flashes. So don't suffer in silence. It really is important to manage your menopausal symptoms. You want to make sure that you're with a menopause-informed coach, someone who understands how the physiology changes and how you have to be more strategic about your workouts and making sure you have the recovery, the fueling, the sleep, the body work, all of that good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
The stress response system just kind of drives your body's ability to meet the challenge. The adaptation is happening with the fitness itself and the ability to recover from that. That's why you need your protein. If you're not getting much protein and you just did a big squat workout, how are those quadriceps going to adapt to that physical challenge if they don't have the building blocks to recover from the challenge? The stress response system is just there to drive meeting the physical challenge. But the work in the recovery from that is in the fueling, the sleep, and all of that, and just making sure you bring that system back to baseline.
Yeah. So having a stress response system that is fully functional, fully operational is what allows us to work hard enough to get those training adaptations. But it's in that recovery period that those things are really solidified. So we need both, right? We need that stress response. We need that pushing us into our training that has some intensity to it. And then we need to also bring that down and recover from it. And these two pieces together form the adaptations and the changes that we're really hoping to have, the way we get fitter, the way we get healthier.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And one of the most common things I hear from women are, they're athletes, they train, they say, the things I was doing before don't work anymore. I hear this
all the time
a day. And it's because you're recovering like a 30-year-old. You're 55 and you're recovering like a 30-year-old. You're doing all the same things at your 30-year-old physiology that worked for recovery, but those same things aren't going to work at 55. So you have to rewrite the book a little bit about recovery. And it just means paying more attention to it and just making sure you're getting enough of all of the recovery things that we talked about.
Now you have to take that part of your training more seriously because you are in a different stage of life. You are in a different physiological space than you were in your 30s.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are biological realities to aging. If you are an elite level athlete for most of your life, and you have trained at your potential for most of your life, your times at 55 are probably not going to be the same as your times at 30. But that doesn't mean that you have to die on the vine and that you have to stop doing your sport. This is why we have age groups for all of our sporting events. CrossFit, every 5 years after 35, you have an age division because there are changes that happen due to age. But it doesn't mean that you can't still make gains and get fitter. You absolutely can. You just have to, like you just said, manage recovery and manage those other things differently than you did when you were 30.
Yeah. One of the key components of recovery is making sure you're eating enough so that you can be fueling for these different activities. I came of age in the 90s where all of the women's health magazines were 1,500 calorie diets and be active. It's not cutting it. It's not cutting it. And I think women are still kind of struggling with being able to wrap their brain around eating enough to train at some of these levels.
Yeah, absolutely. What we knew back in the 90s, I'm with you. I'm a Gen Xer too. I remember it all very well. I have flashbacks about it sometimes.
Yeah.
What was known then is very different from what is known now. We're so much smarter now. Now, granted, there's still a real need for research on female athletes. There is still a dearth of that. But even still, we're a lot smarter now. And so that paradigm is changing. But sometimes the medical community and others don't change with it. And that's where people are still using the 1,200, 1,500 calorie diet and the 3-pound weight.
Yeah.
It's a matter of keeping up with the science. And I think it's important for that science to get out there. But yeah, absolutely. And I was chuckling about the 3-pound weights. I write a blog called Athletic Aging, and I have stock photos, and I'm looking for photos. Oh my God. Do you know how hard it is to find a 55-year-old woman doing a deadlift?
Yes.
Impossible. I'm going to have to just start taking pictures of myself for these things. So it just shows you where society is and where the culture is. And that's probably just as big a barrier as the lack of information. But absolutely, I think there is more of a push. We are learning that the heavy lifting is a great thing for midlife women to do, but it is important to get the appropriate instruction. If you don't have that experience with the barbell, I have a couple of suggestions. One is that you can hire a trainer for 6 weeks just to get you familiar with the basics lifts. Squat, deadlift, bench press, shoulder press. It's really all you need to do. You don't have to be doing snatches, although you can. They're great to do if you can learn how to do them, but start with the basics. The other format that I think is a great way to introduce women to the barbell is a program called Les Mills Body Pump. I don't know if you're familiar with the Les Mills program. You find them in gyms. If you go to a gym, the gym buys a license from Les Mills, and they have instructors that teach these programs. It's group exercise. It's really fun. I used to be an instructor for Les Mills a long time ago. And the body pump program has barbells, weights, steps, everything you can imagine. And it's on the heavier side. And it's a great way in a fun, unintimidating group setting to become familiar with the barbell. And then that can be a segue to getting on the gym floor with a trainer. If he says, we're going to talk about squats. I said, yeah, I know how to do squats. I did that in body pump. And it's a great way to get familiar. So for those other Gen X women out there, it really just takes a little bit to start to get familiar with the barbell. And once you do, you'll be off and running.
All right. So general guidelines that you have for keeping your hormones responsive, for keeping the system. Yeah, exactly.
For my own self, I found great benefits to a mindfulness practice. I meditate every day. I have made it part of my routine. I have a lot going on. I've got a son I just sent off to college. My husband and I are empty nesters. I'm going through this menopause stuff myself. I'm opening up my own practice. My cortisol is redlining every day. And I work out 6 days a week. So I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to do this meditation thing. My coach was telling me to do it. And it was the best thing I ever did. I spend 10 to 20 minutes every morning before I start my day meditating. And it really does get me into great headspace. It's like hitting the reset button. And the app that I love is called Headspace. I think it's awesome. So I think a mindfulness practice can go a long way. And if you're someone like, oh my God, I can't imagine sitting still for 20 minutes, even if it's just 10 mindful breaths, start there. And you'd be surprised at what a difference that would make. So that would be one thing. The second thing I would say that's really important is to take an objective, honest look at what your fueling looks like and what your training looks like. I have so many people, even like nutritionists and dietitians that come to me as athletes and say, oh, my eating's fine. I don't have to worry about it. I'm like, all right, well, let's just track it. Let's just take a look. And then think, oh my goodness, I didn't realize. You don't realize until you collect a little bit of data. Now, I'm not one to track food every single day, but just to get some data points about where you are approximately is a good place to start, because at least half of the midlife women I see are underfueling. And that is why they're hanging on to that belly fat, is because they're underfueling. And the body's hanging on to fat because it's not getting enough energy. So that would be the second big thing that I would say. And then the third is what we've been talking about, is really thinking about recovery. Maybe you spend a little time in the sauna. Make sure your warm-ups and your cool-downs, you don't compromise on those. Get a body worker or a massage therapist. They do wonders to bring that stress response system down as well. So those would be my three big things. Those are the things I use myself and have had great luck with. And patients of mine have had great luck with it too.
Yeah, wholeheartedly buying into the meditation practice. That's a really important thing. But for me, taking my dogs for a longer walk has been really helpful, especially because I'm navigating the changes of perimenopause too. I'm dealing with a huge increase in anxiety and depression. And just like starting to do that, where instead of just taking them for a half an hour, we'll do like an hour every morning, and we build that in. And that just the space that it creates in my head for the day, I feel like I'm starting the day more at baseline rather than red line, where, you know, like some of those days before where I would wake up and I didn't take the dogs for a walk. I feel like I'm at red line from the beginning, from the moment I wake up. It's like, this is not like workable situation. This is not a sustainable thing.
Yeah, that's a great one. There is a lot of data in science that backs getting outside as a way to really center yourself and help to return that system to baseline.
Yeah.
So yeah, getting outside is good.
And my dogs love the trails, and I love the trails.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great one.
So if you think that there's some sort of issue that's going on in your body, whether it be with your stress response or you're suspecting there's some sort of quote unquote cortisol issue, who should you talk to?
You know, it's a big picture thing. Usually if someone is suspecting they have a stress issue, cortisol issue, whatever we want to call it, there are other factors that are being impacted by that. If, say, you're menopausal and you're having all these hot flashes and you're having anxiety, and that you feel is making you have stress issues, then you want to see an endocrinologist or a menopause specialist. Because again, it's all about getting to the root cause of why that stress response system is activated. So you may perceive that your stress response system is activated, but if you take a step back and say, okay, well, why? What's going on in my life? That might lead you to the right person to see. So if it's injury, orthopedic stuff, that might be sports medicine, might be the first place to go. If it's menopause symptoms, you want to see a menopause specialist or an endocrinologist.
Yeah, and I would imagine too that that's a good time to potentially see a mental health professional as well, too, because they would really dig into what else is going on in your life that might be causing this stuff to happen. If it is your life stress, the sandwich generation of women who are going through menopause, taking care of their aging parents, and then sending their kids out into the world, that's a lot to handle. And that could be part of the issue. And just having somebody across from you acknowledging that you got a lot on your plate can be really helpful. It was for me to go talk to a therapist and really see all of this stress that I had started to feel was just normal was really high. Somebody was telling me this is a lot for one person to deal with was really helpful in recognizing that there's a lot of factors in my life that might need to be looked at a little bit closer.
Oh, without a doubt. A therapist is a great tool. Even a life coach. If someone is like, oh, I'm not sure I want to go to a therapist, a life coach, I see a life coach myself, and she's phenomenal. She used to be a CrossFit Games athlete, and she was also my coach during COVID for training and stuff. But yes, a life coach can be great at helping you sort through all of those challenges.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Carla, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience and expertise with us. This has been so helpful.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
So people can find you on your website, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and we'll link to all of those in the show notes so people can find you easily. And then just to give people a little bit of insight into what it is that you're working on and how they can get more from you if they're looking for more support from you, you are launching a medical practice next month, Women's Performance Endocrinology. So tell me a little bit about that and who would be a good fit.
So I've been a reproductive endocrinologist for 18 years. I've been managing hormones for forever. And my life's passion has always been fitness, nutrition, and sport. And I'm at a stage of my career where I have now found the ability to marry those two things together because so many active and high-performing women are struggling with their hormones of all ages. I do a lot of menopausal care. I'm a Menopause Certified Practitioner, but I also take care of a lot of reproductive age women as well. There's a huge need for that skill set. And so that's what my practice is all about. So I'm taking patients now, and you can make an appointment directly on my website at drcarlad.com.
Perfect. We'll link to that. And then our listeners can also subscribe to your newsletters, which I highly recommend. I'm subscribed to Athletic Aging, and then you also have one called Performance Edge. So we will link to those in the show notes as well. This was so great. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you again for having me.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode of the Fit Bottom Girls podcast. But don't worry, we're dropping new episodes every Thursday. In the meantime, head over to the show notes for all the links from today's episode, or go to fitbottomedgirls.com/podcast to catch up on past episodes. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next week.